Okay. To what extent have y'all been able to read? Have you read the section on the UK or no? Len Benicio, you watched the review video. Okay. So why don't we look at this as mine doing an intro to the UK, and then video can go up. We can add some different questions in, but like I'll approach this as like an intro to the UK content, and to a degree walk you through what is typically some of the most important information that I know of that comes up on the exam. And then y'all can ask me questions as we go through it. I'd like to encourage y'all to not necessarily have this be more of a podcast moment, but like do jump in either in the comments or by pausing and you know literally asking me the question, so that I know what I might need to clarify, or what you're not understanding. Does that make sense? If you do like a thumbs up or a,
Yes.
okay. So Benicio, you said Nigeria and Iran. Okay, awesome. All right. So let me get my other headphone on here and we'll get started and bring it up. Yeah, of course I format everything, and this will be fun. I format everything for PowerPoint. Then when I upload it, it looks all different. But we're gonna share what we've got, and we're gonna go from there. Okay, and I'm going to screen share here in a moment. Give me just a second. One moment, please. I need to make sure that my phone is off. That y'all have, we're like completely focused here. and not just vacation focused. And I do hope that you've been getting to have at least part of a break so far. It's super important. Okay. So now phone is off and we are good. Okay, so no. Here we go. All right, so you should see the map, everything. We can see everything that I've got on the screen. Yes.
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So one of the main things you'll notice, we've got these three areas in the UK that are separated from England: Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Officially, the UK is referred to as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But it's key that you think about this for the exam, especially as a good example of nationhood. This is usually how the College Board presents it, because there's the difference between the nation and the state. And it was we've talked about this in class. It was in the notes that we went over last week. It's in the notes that I put up online, along with the Quizlets. Like, use those Quizlets, folks. Like, I will freely admit they've taken more than a little bit of time to create. I think they're going to be really helpful. So look at that section on the Discord where I have the Quizlets and all the baseline concepts. But what's important to know is the difference. Keep in mind the difference between a nation and a state. And a nation, definition of a nation is a group of people who are united together based on a common historical experience, language, ethnicity, culture, religion, generally defined by a geographic area, but not always. And that a state is the governance of a nation, or sometimes multiple nations. So countries are referred to as nation states. And for the purpose of the exam, you can just always say like state or country when you're talking about the government or the political culture of a state or country. But you want to make sure that when you're talking about specific identities or differences within a country, that usually we're referring to different nations. And Great Britain, in terms of what consists of Great Britain, okay? Scotland, Wales, England, that is Great Britain. Northern Ireland is the United Kingdom. All right. Britons feel both part of and apart from Europe. We see this really clear with Brexit and how that all played out. It also seems pretty clear in terms of supranational organizations that Britons said we want to be apart from and do things more on our own. So we have one state, four nations, England, Scotland, and Wales, plus Northern Ireland. Here's, I will see if this actually works. Hold on. Got the short little video. Hold on, let me go back for a second. Okay, well, so we're not going to do that. I'll put the video up separately. So scratch that. We'll go back to what I was sharing earlier. Hold on, we'll go back to what I was sharing earlier, and I'll just put up the video separately. So basically, just explains what I just said. Okay. Quick historical timeline. I'll be honest with you folks, I rarely have seen things come up on the exam in any of the countries that are going to like have you go through the entire background history of Iran. Rather focusing on key or pivotal historical moments like the collapse of the Soviet Union or the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Communist Revolution, or the death of Mao Zedong, or in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, or the protests in 1968, etc. So in the case of the UK, the purpose of knowing the history, the point of it is to look at the UK as an example of a democracy which has developed over time. Specifically, one of the strongest examples of democratic consolidation that's happened that gets mirrored in other parts of the world. It's kind of how the College Board looks at it. And the steps in this, we start with the Magna Carta as the foundational text that establishes rights that people who are not the king have, even though they're wealthy landowners, versus everybody else in Britain at the time. And then there are additional laws and actions, whether it's the Petition of Right or the Bill of Rights of the Glorious Revolution or the Reform Acts or the Parliament Act of 1911. And I'll talk about the beverage plan in a moment. But the purpose of knowing this or seeing this timeline is not that you have to know all of these specific dates. And you have to know all of these specific events. What's important is that you're able to refer to Great Britain as an example of democratic consolidation, of increased democratization over time, and the evolution of Britain into first what will be a country with a very specific and structured welfare state that then that welfare state gets kind of taken apart in the 1980s and then more in the 1990s to reflect more of a free market, less government involvement in industry kind of situation. So other key events and concepts. Actually, let me go back for a second. All right. You might need to know about the beverage plan. And you'll see this on another slide in a second. This has to do with the reasons behind establishing a social welfare system. If you notice date, this is right at the end of the 1930s. We're at the peak of the Great Depression. This was Great Britain looking at where things were during the Great Depression for the entire country and saying, what are the challenges that our country has that need to be addressed through government policy. And then with World War with World War II, what emerges out of World War II is this concept. So this concept of collective consensus is something that does show up on the exam, especially as a multiple choice question, of the way that decisions are made and policy is created in the United Kingdom. And the first example of that is the Beveridge Report, which establishes the fact that, hey, in the UK, we have these really big social and economic and employment issues. How are we going to solve them? We're going to solve them by creating a collective consensus of what needs to be changed and the policies that need to be enacted in order for us to become a stronger nation. So you get the establishment of a welfare state, so a country with specific social support systems, one of those being the National Health Service or NHS. So the UK does have universal baseline healthcare for all citizens in Great Britain. A commitment to Keynesian economics, Keynesian economics being economics that focuses on government intervention in the economy. So it's kind of the opposite of free market economics. This is about intervening in government guiding economic growth or being involved in key industries and using government funds to do that. And then also the dismantling of the British Empire, which again doesn't really show up on the exam, but you should just be able to place this in the larger context of what you would have learned in global history. But the collective consensus concept is important. There's then a shift in the 1970s, similar to the United States, where Britain's economy is going to slow down. Oil prices are going to impact employment. There are going to be questions asked about how expensive maintaining all these government services and having this welfare state is. And out of that will come Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister of the UK, and a shift away from the social welfare state and toward neoliberalism, which is a policy, or neoliberalism is an ideology that focuses on policies that increase free markets and that decrease the size of government and the involvement of government in people's lives through a heavily pervasive social welfare state. Thatcher will then lose the prime ministership. She actually steps down. She's succeeded by John Major. I don't think you're going to see him on the exam. He doesn't really come up. Thatcher will. But in the 90s, you could see Tony Blair just as an example of a leader who kind of uses the concept of a collective consensus to change the approach that the Labour Party had prior to Margaret Thatcher's being in office, which he will refer to as New Labour or the Third Way, which basically means having aspects of neoliberalism be part of the Labour Party's approaches to govern. In other words, not having the Labour Party, which is very much focused on the social welfare state, actually increase the size of government, but having the Labour Party focus on things like government efficiency and not shrinking government, but making government more effective. Don't think you'll see Gordon Brown. He's just the prime minister after Tony Blair. I will briefly walk you through the importance of David Cameron. So in 2010, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's Labour government loses Parliament, and the Conservatives win not a majority, but a plurality in government, which means they have to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. That coalition ends in 2015 when David Cameron becomes prime minister after the election in 2015 that the Conservatives decisively win. After 2015, we get Brexit. David Cameron resigns. Theresa May becomes prime minister. And in all of the chaos that emerges out of trying to solidify Britain's exit from the EU, Theresa May eventually loses her position. She leaves her position as prime minister despite surviving 3 votes of no confidence, 2 in Parliament and 1 among her own party. She steps down and we get Boris Johnson, who has moved the country through Brexit and now into a independent, non-EU linked country. All right. So the other concept, working backward from collective consensus, is the idea again of the UK as an evolutionary democracy, where legitimacy, this is important for the exam, where we talk about like what legitimizes a regime and a government. For Britain, what legitimizes the government is tradition and common law or history of a rational legal authority. So rational legal authority being the collection of documents, precedents, actions of government made over Great Britain and the UK's long history to bring us to where we are now in the country. So Britain does not have a written constitution. They have what is called common law, which is the collection of all the legal documents and precedents that establish the powers that Parliament has, the powers that the Queen has, and the role of government in people's lives. Okay, so this is why, again, Britain is referred to as an evolutionary democracy. The monarchy moves from having more or less absolute power under Elizabeth I to having a symbolic role at this point with Elizabeth II. As I frequently say, like, she shows up to important state events. She is the head of state, shakes people's hands, meets foreign dignitaries, wears really cool hats. And that's kind of all she does. Although there are important symbolic acts that she takes in terms of how parliament is run and also how laws are passed that are part of uh, demonstrating the power of the monarchy in British government. Um, so Parliament's rise to power, kind of think about this as like the queen as having, or the monarchy as having the power, Parliament grasping for power, and the queen losing it over time. So this is referred to as gradualism. You get a gradual extension of voting rights. Most of these people are, like we've talked about with Mexico, gaining wealth and education throughout the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. An example of this is the Great Reform Act of 1832, where 300,000 men, some of them who had property, some of them did not, were able to vote for the first time. The suffrage is then extended in 1918 to, notice the age though, women under the age of 28 and men under over the age of 21. That's then shifted in 1929 to women over the age of 21. And then it gets lowered again. So the point is, the concept you want to know with Britain is gradualism, and that voting rights were not absolute the way that they were established in a constitution like Mexico or Russia or Nigeria or the United States, but that they evolved over time. You'll see this on the website with the Discord with the slides. It will be important, and I would suggest on this that you look at the Quizlets that I put up to be able to define what free market capitalism is. So having trade and economic growth that is as limited as possible by the government, and that increases possibilities for individual choice versus a welfare state with Keynesian economics, greater government intervention in the economy, and to be able to identify benefits and drawbacks of this. This is the kind of thing that could show up as a comparison question, although I haven't seen it for a while. I'm going to check chat. Yeah, Lynn, yes, voting rights in the United States evolve over time, but the reason that I described it the way that I did is that all men, for the most part, receive suffrage at the writing of the Constitution. We can look at things evolving over time with like people who were enslaved gaining the right to vote, women gaining the right to vote. But it's not an evolutionary democracy in the sense that Britain is, because Britain does not have a founding document where these rights were listed out. They instead, in terms of voting, they have instead passed multiple laws to have those voting rights established, as opposed to writing amendments to a foundational document. Yeah, Benicio, rule by law versus rule of law. On that one, what I suggest that you do is go directly into the flashcard decks or the Quizlet decks that I've got. It's got it there. And in fact, there is a set of flashcards that compares the two of them. I can show you that if you hold on for a second. I can show you that once we wrap up a little bit more of this, what that looks like. But it's all there. Like all of that stuff is there, those foundational concepts. Okay. Again, collective consensus immediately after World War II was the idea that the goal of good government policy was working toward narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor, creating a welfare state. This is based on what's called the Beveridge Report. I don't get it, Beveridge. report. I don't think you'll see the Beveridge report on the exam, but you will see the concept of a welfare state, which is public policies designed to provide for citizens' needs, whether it's pensions, universal health care, or assistance to the poor. The big one again on this is the National Health Service that is created in 1948. But the view immediately after World War II was that the state, the British state, was responsible for economic growth and full employment of everybody living in the United Kingdom. That was not supportable from the standpoint of conservatives like Margaret Thatcher, who moved in the direction of neoliberalism in the 1970s and 1980s. So again, I kind of brought up the rationale for this, but what you might want to think about if you were asked to, on a concept question, identify the concept and describe the concept of a welfare state. If you're asked to explain it further, here would be kind of the direction you could go with this in a free response question. And that is, during World War I, during World War II, there was direct state involvement in the war effort, also with the Great Depression, that led to a view that the government, if we're going to have the government involved in guiding the economy and the response to the Depression and to war, that also needs to be a government that has policy that supports the betterment of the people of Great Britain as a whole. Okay. This is again history, so I'm not going to spend tons of time going through this. I don't think, again, you really don't see much of the history and this level of detail in the exam. What you do see is the information about the political parties, similarly to kind of how political parties change over time in Mexico, right? So one similarity between Mexico and the UK is that Mexico has a fair amount of government intervention in the economy. If you look on the Quizlets, got the concept of import substitution industrialization, where there are higher tariffs and protection of the domestic production within a country by the government itself. Okay, that's an example of, in Mexico, of similar policies that happened in the UK, where a great deal of government assistance was provided for industries that otherwise might have been struggling by the 1970s, specifically something like the coal industry. By the 1970s, you've got this economic crisis, high unemployment, labor unions are on strike, production has been decreasing, Britain's lost its colonies by the 1970s, which means they've also lost markets. Something needed to change because there wasn't, Britain didn't have the financial resources that it did before. And it is Margaret Thatcher who kind of led the way on these changes with the concept of neoliberalism. She is going to argue that these collectivist policies that we needed to, Britain needed to relook at them, and the idea of collective consensus needed to be revisited, not to focus on the role of the state, but more a collective consensus on how can we increase individual choice and the power of individuals to create the future that they want to have for themselves. She privatizes businesses, she privatizes industries. When I say industries, that means the coal industry, the railway industry, major infrastructure parts of the UK were guided by the government and also supported through government financial intervention. Margaret Thatcher argued that that should be lessened, that social welfare programs should be reduced so that people have more independence to take action to support their own livelihoods as opposed to having a greater dependence on the government. She's referred to as a milk snatcher, Margaret Thatcher, the milk snatcher, because she was taking the milk, the the like the additional food programs, for example, that Britain had for its population that might struggle socioeconomically, and reducing them or even getting rid of them altogether. She was very tough on labor unions, went toward the direction of market forces and a more free market economy. And again, here I put in the definition of neoliberalism. It's also in the Quizlet deck for the key terms and concepts section that I put in the Discord. Neoliberalism is defined as the revival of classic liberal values that promote free competition among businesses within a market, including reduced government regulation and social spending. Think of liberal in this sense, not in terms of liberal versus conservatism in the United States, but liberal in the sense of libertarian policies, which is small government, which is about liberty and choice. That is the European sense of what liberalism is. So here is a question that I usually ask students to ponder. You can think about, is it a contradiction that a member of the Conservative Party, conservatives are very focused on tradition, right? That's the very essence of what it means to be conservative, that you carry actions that have been taken in the past, that have an established track record of supporting families, supporting government, having policies that work, and you don't change those significantly as you move into the future. And Margaret Thatcher, as a conservative, comes into office and makes this big change with neoliberalism and moves away from the welfare state. And the reason that Margaret Thatcher is not betraying conservatism is, like I said earlier, that liberalism has a different meaning in the United Kingdom than it does in the United States, where the idea of liberalism means less government intervention in people's lives and in government, in business, okay? You might see a question, multiple choice, about this specific concept of liberalism come up. And in terms of policy connections, all right, this connection of neoliberalism, or this concept of neoliberalism, could best be linked with two other policies like NAFTA, where we're going to open up free trade, we're going to open up markets, have less government intervention in trade, like tariffs, one, and two, Boris Yeltsin's shock therapy that happens after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where a very rapid transition takes place to a more free market economy with less government intervention and government ownership of businesses. This is all, again, if you think about it, at the same time in the 80s and 90s. And some of these neoliberal policies have been more successful than others. I just put this in here as NAFTA is a good example of a neoliberal trade agreement. I would also, again, keep in mind something like shock therapy, Boris Yeltsin's shock therapy in Russia as another parallel. I just put in a couple of images, cartoons about Mrs. Thatcher. She ends up being Baroness Thatcher. Ends up being very both controversial, but also not well liked by the time she leaves office. The most popular song in the UK the week that Margaret Thatcher died was Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead from The Wizard of Oz. So people have very strong feelings about Margaret Thatcher as a leader. Not something that would show up on the exam, but important for you to know in terms of the concept of reactions to neoliberal policies. Again, also think about the uprising in Mexico in response to NAFTA and the government of Mexico moving away from supporting the ejidos, the tenant farmers in southern Mexico and Chiapas, and pushing back against that. This is just a kind of overview of Margaret Thatcher's life in the context of kind of Britain's history as a whole. Just here for you to see, not something that in large detail is going to come up on the exam. It is important that you be able to identify what neoliberalism is, and at least one specific policy that Margaret Thatcher had that demonstrates neoliberalism. And again, that would be something like reducing the influence of trade unions, shrinking the size of government, limiting social welfare programs, privatizing businesses, railroads, the coal industry, and eventually, as time will go on with conservatives, privatizing parts of the National Health Service. Okay, Tony Blair, New Labour, or the Third Way. He will be prime minister for a decade, which is almost as long as Margaret Thatcher. He is trying to reinvent the Labour Party, which prior to 1997 was the party of unions, workers, a social welfare state, having a great deal of government involvement and support of citizens. Again, the Beveridge Report came out of a Labour government. Tony Blair tries to change that and is actually very successful in doing so. He's in office for a decade. He emphasizes the historic ties between labor governments and trade unions, and emphasizes partnerships with business, but does not emphasize government's role in facilitating the growth of business or the power of unions. So this is where you get the kind of carryover of Margaret Thatcher's legacy of neoliberalism. For a parallel with the United States, you can think of, just not for exam purposes, but just as a helpful contextualization, Ronald Reagan as president in the 1980s, who embraces neoliberalism, and then Bill Clinton as the president after George H.W. Bush serves one term, who also, as a Democrat, embraces neoliberal ideas, again, like NAFTA. Okay, here's what's important, and I mentioned devolution when we were in class and going through, and some of you were there for that, others of you were not, but we were going through key concepts. Devolution is a concept for the exam that you absolutely must know. It's super important. And devolution is the decentralization of power, moving from London, from the capital, out to these three separate nations within the United Kingdom. So decision-making, policy-making in certain areas being given back to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I'll run you through the House of Lords, but it is important to know that the House of Lords is the upper house. It is not just hereditary. In fact, the number of hereditary peers in the House of Lords is very, very small. That most of the people who are in the House of Lords are actually appointed by the House of Commons, approved of, like the Queen gives her thumbs up, and then the House of Commons votes to make that person a Lord. Additional changes that Tony Blair makes incorporates the International Convention on Human Rights into British law, and gets rid of this part of the Labour Party's constitution that focuses on the state's ownership of production, distribution, and exchange. And again, in the flashcards, you'll see the concept of corporatism and how that is the approach that the government is heavily tied to corporations and corporate interests. insofar as the government is supporting corporations. Um, this was a movement away from labor, from the concept of state corporatism, where the government actually owns certain means of production or owns businesses again, like the coal industry or railroads, or runs all the hospitals. What causes Tony Blair to eventually have to leave office is protests and the enormous backlash against his closeness to George W. Bush and the war in Iraq. Cartoon about that. All right, so one of the things that does come up in the exam that's, again, super important is the 2010 election in the UK. Looking at it as a change not only in government, because we elect a conservative government under David Cameron, but also possibly a change in regime. Because remember, a regime change means that there's not just a change in government, but also some changes in structurally how that government is put together. That can also happen through a revolution or coup d'etat, but elections can result in regime change as well. And in 2010, David Cameron's election as a conservative, the conservative parties regaining a plurality, not a majority, in parliament is viewed as you could argue on a short answer question that's an example of a regime change. What happens though is because the Conservative Party does not receive a majority of the seats in parliament, and again, super important, we do not have direct election of the prime minister in the United Kingdom. You have direct elections of members of parliament or MPs, and then whichever party gains a majority of the seats in parliament, the leader of that party becomes the prime minister. All right. The Conservative Party didn't gain a majority. They only had a plurality. This is a situation which is referred to as a hung parliament, where no party gets a majority of the seats. So what was necessary was for David Cameron and the Conservative Party to form an alliance with the Liberal Democratic Party led by Nick Clegg. Okay. Liberal Democratic Party, think of liberal and liberalism in the sense of neoliberalism. The Liberal Democratic Party was focused and continues to be very focused on free market practices. They are in smaller government, so there's kind of the connection with the conservatives. But unlike the conservatives, as time goes on, they are more pro-EU. They are younger. They're not in favor of extreme changes to the NHS. Also, as a result of their working with the conservatives, because they've never been in government before ever. They had never been able to have a prime minister or ministers in government. As a result of the Liberal Democrats working with David Cameron after 2010, between 2010 and 2015, they are largely voted out of power. Their party is now not influential in any way, shape, or form in the UK, really. Okay. The one concept right here, austerity, is one that can show up on the AP exam, either as a multiple choice question or as a question kind of about government policy and economics. So remember date, the election that David Cameron gains, the Conservatives gain a majority is 2010, or I'm sorry, a plurality is in 2010. That's 2 years after the financial crisis. And Britain was still experiencing, like all of the world was, the fallout from that financial crisis. And so the Conservative Party's approach, as they kind of worked with the Liberal Democrats, was to enact a policy of austerity. And austerity is reducing public spending generally as the result of a financial crisis, reducing the size of the welfare state, reducing deficit. Deficit means a deficit is when a government is spending more money than it receives in taxes. Having spending that are deficits means that a country can run debt. The Conservative Party did not want the United Kingdom to be in debt or stay in debt. And one of the impacts of David Cameron's, or one of the key impacts of David Cameron's approach to austerity is the slight privatization of some aspects of the National Health Service, of education being, parts of education being more privatized, and the shrinking of the welfare state. These are not long-term, very popular actions, in that it really polarizes the country, basically. The Conservatives still will be voted into power, but David Cameron is not viewed really super positively. And like I said, the Liberal Democrats lose their majority, or I'm sorry, lose their governing coalition in the 2015 election. One other thing to bring up that can sometimes show up, remember we did the short answer to the free response question about term limits, okay? Under British common law, we don't have term limits, but we do have timed elections. So the prime ministership is not a position with term limits, but elections in the UK have to happen every 5 years, from whenever the last election was. And that action was taken under Tony Blair's Labour government, and instituted for the 2010 election. So election in 2010, 5 years later, we've got a timed election in 2015. There can be an election in the in-between time. That's called a snap election. If Parliament passes an act to have there be an earlier election. That is something that will happen after 2015. But if you were asked a comparative question or an evaluative question about term limits, this would be an excellent place to possibly have a counterexample of a law being passed that limits the time that someone may be in office by establishing a regular interval for an election without there being a written constitutional requirement to prevent someone from being in office. So you have the possibility of getting public input to continue the policies in the existing administration if they vote to keep people in the seats from the same party as the existing prime minister. Okay, so 2015 election results, Conservative Party. Again, this is a plurality vote. This is, I put the term in the Quizlets and the term section on the Discord. The concept is the first past the post, not a majoritarian approach. So whoever earns the highest percentage of the votes will gain a seat in Parliament, and whichever party receives a majority of the seats, or I'm sorry, a plurality of the seats in Parliament. Let me rephrase that, I'll back up. Whichever party who gains a majority of seats in Parliament can form a government. What's important to keep in mind with Britain, and this could be viewed as a flaw of the British approach to the way that Parliament is constructed and governments are formed, is that, notice again, 36.9% of the vote went to the Conservative Party in terms of numbers of votes, but they ended up with a majority of seats in Parliament and formed the government. So a flaw of Parliament, of a parliamentary system, in the, you'll see it in a separate set of slides, the Westminster model, is that it is possible for a country to be governed by a party which has a majority of seats in Parliament and the party leader, who's the prime minister, but that did not receive a majority of the vote, instead received a plurality of the vote. Just something to kind of keep in mind in terms of maybe arguing about which is more beneficial when it comes to a presidential versus a parliamentary system, because here the executive is being selected without a majority of the public's input, as opposed to a presidential election where you get the direct input in Mexico, in Russia, and in Nigeria in obtaining the result of who people want to have as the executive. Okay. One of the things that happens after 2015, or that was part of the 2015 election, is that David Cameron said that he would absolutely hold a Brexit vote. It's not called Brexit, it's called an in-out, the EU referendum. It will eventually be referred to as Brexit, that he would continue the austerity measures, and the upshot, the result of the Brexit vote, as we know now, the Brexit vote, which happens in 2016, is that Britain does eventually leave the EU. They take action to separate from the EU as a supranational organization, increase sovereignty, increase the flexibility that they feel they have when it comes to trade policies, immigration policies, and education policies, just as a couple of examples, and become more independent. I think, yeah, I'm going to actually stop sharing there. I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause recording as well, because we just covered a bunch of information. And I talked for almost an hour. I want to check in and see where we're doing. What are, if any, questions that this is bringing up for folks right now? Yeah, Benicio, you don't even have to raise your hand. You can just speak. Sing out, Louise.
Okay. You mentioned a little bit on, I think you like quickly touched upon corporatism. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about corporatism, like neo-corporatism, and like its compatibility with like parliamentary democracy, because I came across that a little bit when I was like reviewing.
Yes. So why don't I use that as an opportunity to do some screen sharing of what I put up on the Discord, so that when I put this video up, other people hopefully can see as well. Yeah. And actually, when with the structures of British government, um, that's a separate set of slides. I can run this through quickly, or that'll put up as a video. The thing to just know with the vote of no confidence is that it's a way to remove the prime minister of the UK by parliament and a majority vote, saying that they do not support the prime minister. Remember that in order to gain the prime ministership, a party has to gain a majority of the seats in parliament. May not get a majority of the vote, but will obtain a plurality of the vote. In a vote of no confidence, it means that members of the prime minister's own party have to vote against having the prime minister be the executive. And the comparative part of this is looking at the advantages and disadvantages of a presidential versus a parliamentary system. Okay. And we can argue that the benefit of the parliamentary system is that you have an executive who can be fairly efficiently removed from power through a simple vote of no confidence by the legislature, versus in a presidential system where the president benefit elected by the people directly. okay, either through a plurality or a majority. Plurality in Mexico, majority in Russia, and a majority with a qualification. There's a yes, but that will come up with Nigeria. Um, and in order to get rid of that executive, you have to go through an entire political and legal process of um, impeachment. We've experienced twice, and the last president. You can't just have a simple vote of no confidence to remove the prime minister. And when a vote of no confidence happens in the British Parliament, the prime minister steps down. Again, that's the tradition. There's not a law, there's not a constitution that says that that's what has to happen. That's tradition. If you lose the vote of no confidence, you're going to step down as prime minister. And like I mentioned earlier, the prime minister comes after David Cameron, Theresa May, who is going to start leading the UK in 2016, 2017. When after the election that happens in 2019, she loses, or I'm sorry, wins votes of no confidence, but it's a very close vote from within her own party. So there's a party only vote of no confidence and then a vote of no confidence in Parliament as a whole. But she eventually steps down because she feels she doesn't have the support that she needs to govern Britain and take it through Brexit. Yes, she did survive multiple votes of no confidence, but stepped down because she was losing the support of her own party when it came to actually making Brexit happen, which is why Boris Johnson will become prime minister. And then there's another set of, there's an election that happens to confirm his leadership of the party by having new elections in Britain in 2019. And where the Conservatives gain a majority of the seats. So it's winter 2019. The Conservatives gain a majority of seats in Parliament and the prime ministership under Boris Johnson. Does that address your question? Okay, awesome. So Benicio, let's go back to your question about corporatism, right? I'm going to pause the screen sharing for just a minute. Oh, wait, I still have it paused. Whoops. So no need to worry about that. Let me go into the Discord and I'll show you what I'm talking about when it comes to the concept reviews. All right, so I'm going to screen share very quickly. All right, so Benicio, to your question, if we go into the Discord, you'll see that I've got the notes for Great Britain already in the Great Britain section, and things that I'm going to be adding to that. The other countries are going to follow very quickly over the next couple of days. But with the concept review, okay, I have all of the foundational concept notes. So all the notes on every foundational concept that could come up in a test situation. And these are like foundational concepts are what are most likely to come up in the free response. And then I've broken them down the same way that they are in the notes. Okay, here by topics. All right. The purpose behind that is, and I'm pretty sure that corporatism is under the globalization question or globalization section. We'll double check. I'm going to scroll down here. Oh, I'm going to go back because I was wrong. It is under political and ideological spectrums. got all the others. Let me look at this one. Again, these are all Quizlet docs. Now I have to find out where I put it. Let me stop screen sharing for a second and see if I can find it. So the purpose here is for me to be able to show you what it looks like rather than just having me explain it. Scroll here for a couple of things. Oh, actually, no, this is, yeah, I've got it. So here we go. So Benicia, you also asked earlier about rule of law versus rule by law, correct? Am I remember that correctly? Yeah, okay, awesome. So the place you wanna look in with the foundational concepts, and what I would suggest doing with this to make it as user-friendly as possible, would be, again, to first look at the notes. Which I put here. Okay, scroll through the notes, identify with these terms and concepts, areas that you feel like, okay, I'm not sure if I remember that specific concept or I know what that specific concept is. Then go back into the section where that concept is and the Quizlet for it, okay? So if we go back to, this is under other political institutions. You asked about the difference between rule of law and rule by law. So I list in the definitions, we got definitions for common law, gave the example of the UK, civil or code law, which is a legal system based on explicitly written laws like in Mexico, Russia, China, or Nigeria. And then Sharia law, which comes up with Iran. And here we have rule of law versus rule by law. Rule of law is when we have a legal system where the judicial system, if there's a Supreme Court that interprets the Constitution, is separate, independent, accountable, meaning that judges can be either removed or there's a process for putting them into place through a nomination system, and written principles that are followed either with a constitution or, in the case of the UK, code law. I'm sorry, common law. Rule by law, all right, so here we have rule of law is the judicial system follows existing laws and precedent and the Constitution in order to make decisions and in order to enforce guidelines of the government, okay? Rule by law is when laws are used to enforce the will of authorities rather than the text of a constitution and the text of the law. So rule by law is something that exists in China because the Chinese Communist Party uses legal action and enforcement of laws to support its goals and the functionings of good government from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective. Think about Xi Jinping's purges of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government of people accused of corruption, for example, or the surveillance state that exists with the social credit system, or also the Great Firewall of China and the control or limitation of the internet in China. That is all rule by law, where there are existing laws that are used to keep authority and legitimacy with the existing government and regime. Iran does have a similar situation that is described might come up on the exam as rule by law, and that is the use of Sharia law, the interpretation of the Quran under Shia Islam and Sharia law under Shia Islam to drive actions and decisions by the government that reinforce the government's authority and the power of Shia Muslim political and religious leaders. And this is called, there's a specific term for this called Valiat Afaki or Juris guardianship that I'll go over when I do a little video on Iran. But it's just a parallel with China that you might see. There's a comparison question or something comes up about rule by law. The parallel for China would be the country of Iran. Does that address your earlier question with rule of law versus rule by law? And you're gonna have to say yes or no because I'm screen sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, so in that same slide deck, if you slide down, okay, corporatism, in terms of how it comes up on the exam, is usually placed in opposition to the concept of pluralism. And it has to do with interest groups. So you remember that an interest group, okay, an interest group is an example of a linkage institution, which is a structure that connects people to the government. An interest group system can consist of everything from political parties to unions to religious organizations. These are all linkage institutions. In a country with corporatism or a corporatist interest group system, there are few interest groups. They're co-opted by the government. And those interest groups that are co-opted by the government get kind of exclusive access to the government when it comes to making decisions. So there's an overlap between the government and corporations, which are just organizations that engage in business practices. And because of that overlap, you have a great deal of influence and power that people have who are leading these corporations. And also, we've talked about, it's come up in class, the idea of patron clientelism, or the use of favors and connections politically and socially and monetarily that people have with each other in order to drive decision making and wealth growth. Okay, so an example of corporatism or examples of corporatism would be Russia, currently under Vladimir Putin, with companies like Gazprom or Rosneft, or the banking system in Russia. Mexico under PRI is heavily corporatist, with the country's oil production being controlled by Pemex. Nigeria has a fairly heavy corporatist approach. The Power and Light Company, for example, is owned and run by the government, or Iran, which is heavily corporatist because Iran also, the government owns the means of production for oil. Okay. The converse of this is pluralism, where interest groups are multiple, they are in competition with one another, they have access to policymakers that they're constantly having to fight for with each other. The UK is the example of a pluralist interest group system. It moves into this over time after the 1970s, and increasingly Mexico, because corporatist interests are being de-emphasized. How we doing? Does that kind of address the question that you were asking?
Yeah. So I see. So like pluralism is just like the competitive opposite version of corporatism.
Yeah, I would describe, instead of necessarily describing pluralism as the opposite of corporatism, that it's about increasing the number. pluralism is about increasing the number of interest groups to open up engagement in government when it comes to creation of policy to as many people as possible. Corporatism is about advancing the needs of the state to hopefully benefit as many people as possible, but it involves smaller groups of people. That leaves the government open to, in policy creation, open to manipulation or corruption. Is that how we doing there with that?
Yeah, I that's that's great. Thank you.
Okay, I don't think that you'll see neo-corporatism on the exam. Like it's essentially all, the best of my understanding in terms of neo-corporatism, how it works, is about creating government, what are called private-public partnerships, where the government works with corporations, but the corporations are still private and not government owned, government run, or have a major government control of. And the United States has kind of sometimes moved in the direction of neo-corporatism. I don't think you're going to see it on the exam, though. Watch me be wrong, but I don't think you're going to see it as a policy approach. They usually do corporatism, pluralism, and then the other concept is state corporatism, which is complete national control of specific industries like China and the steel industry, the coal industry under Labor Party control and influence and collective consensus after World War II, things like that. Other questions? Let me like open it up a little bit more. Carrie, Lynn, questions, things that you've come across so far that I can also answer any questions you might have about. You're okay so far? Len, you okay? Benicio, you as well? Is there anything that you've come across that I can clarify, especially with those foundational terms? I'm guessing based on the silence that we're good. The other three of you folks, yeah, so we're okay. Obviously, we've got government structures. Let me see really quickly if I can bring that up. Bear with me for a second, folks. Um, yeah, okay, let me do this really fast. And this will, I think I need to upload this still because this will take you through Great Britain with a little bit more information about the government structure. I just need to do, okay, I'm going to screen share real quick. Yeah, no, it's okay, Lynn. I'll just watch what you're typing a little bit more carefully. Okay, so just a real quick rundown on the British government structure. So this is the parliamentary system. and how the parliamentary system is structured and how it functions in the UK. So remember how I mentioned David Cameron has to govern with coalition. Even though he's the prime minister, with Nick Clegg is kind of this co-prime minister. He's like a deputy prime minister, which they just created that position for him. In 2015, Liberal Democrats lose a large number of seats. The Conservatives win a majority of the seats and a plurality of the vote, like you saw. And here is David Cameron with his Conservative cabinet. It's really important to remember in a parliamentary system that the Prime Minister is not only the executive, but also a member of Parliament, and all of the cabinet ministers, or as they're called in the UK now, secretaries, are, with very few exceptions, also members of Parliament. So it is in the presidential versus parliamentary system Quizlet deck. The concept that is used to describe this is a fused executive, where the executive branch, the prime minister, is fused, combined with the legislative branch. Benefit of that is quick decision making. Unless we're talking about Brexit. So as I mentioned before, David Cameron said that he would step down if the Brexit vote went through. He did. The British Conservative Party put forward Theresa May, here she is, as the Prime Minister. You might notice that the cabinet under Theresa May is not only smaller, but significantly less diverse in terms of who's in it. And there's Boris Johnson, the foreign secretary. He would actually was one of the people in charge of interacting with all the other countries in the EU with Brexit, which is one of the reasons that he kind of ends up becoming prime minister after Theresa May steps down in 2019. Okay, so this is the 2010 election, just so you can see it visually. All right. Here's Parliament. All the blue seats were held by Conservatives. All right. But there we have 650 seats in Parliament. We have to have a majority in order to govern. All right. 650 divided by 2, you need at least 325 seats. The Conservative Party didn't have it. They only had 302. So they added in 56 seats from the Liberal Democrats in the coalition government. The Labour Party was then therefore what's referred to as the opposition, or sometimes the loyal opposition. They're loyal because they are loyal to Parliament as a whole. They literally sit opposite one another in Parliament. This only lasts until 2015, which again, like you saw, the Conservatives take a total majority on. Britain, it's important to remember, is multi-party. Okay, so we have these other parties that are national in nature, like the Scottish Liberal or Scottish National Party, Sinn Féin, which is for Northern Ireland, or Plaid Cymru, which is a party in Wales. The UK Independence Party, or UKIP, focused solely on making Brexit happen. Notice they had 2 little seats in 2010. The party no longer exists anymore. So they were there for a hot second, now they're gone. After the parliamentary elections in 2015, again, no longer have a coalition. We've got David Cameron's Conservative government, with the Liberal Democrats only having 8 seats, when before they had 56. Okay. And this was a slide that I would typically do in class, where you look at the 2 infographics and assess the political consequences. The main idea here, folks, is we have a coalition government where the Liberal Democrats had to work together. I'm sorry, the Conservatives had to work together with the Liberal Democrats to get things done. By 2015, hey, we want to have austerity policies. We want to reduce government spending. They're able to do this we want to have a Brexit vote. They're able to do this without needing the support of the Liberal Democrats. And this is where things were after David Cameron's stepping down. Theresa May was prime minister from 2016 until 2019. And here, Jeremy Corbyn, who's no longer the head of Labour, he was the head of the opposition, with Nicola Sturgeon being the head of the Scottish National Party. Again, we get to change after 2017. You might notice in 2017, Conservative Party does not get a majority. They do not get 325 seats. So they actually have to form a coalition again. This is the 2017 election. Do the math. 2010, 2015, 5 years. 2017, we have another election. That is because it was a snap election called by Theresa May and the Conservative Party in order to really solidify what they thought was like as much support as possible, but they really had people had their back when it came to Brexit. People didn't support them. So there needed to be a coalition government again in 2017, and the Conservatives made that coalition government with the Democratic Unionist Party, or the DUP, which is a national party in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin is Irish nationalist, so they are people who support Northern Ireland becoming part of Ireland again. The Democratic Unionist Party support Northern Ireland staying separate and part of the UK. Super conservative. So Brexit was a big mess after 2017. It was a big mess until 2019. Theresa May ends up leaving the leadership of the Conservative Party. Boris Johnson becomes prime minister, and then there's an election in 2019. This is where I just run you through the different parties so that you can see them in the slide deck. And here's kind of like the structural part of the British government. So Britain bicameral. It's referred to as an asymmetrical bicameral legislature because the House of Commons has more power when it comes to making laws and decisions. The upper house, the House of Lords, can debate, but they can't stop a bill from being passed. They really don't have much say in terms of how policy gets created like they do in the House of Commons. Similarity with this in terms of an asymmetrical bicameral legislature would be the Duma and the Federation Council in Russia. So House of Commons, what happens in the House of Commons? Make laws, it's a center of public debate, source of government ministers. Again, if you're comparing legislatures in a presidential versus parliamentary system. In a presidential system, the executive is separate. Again, that means that the cabinet does not come from within the legislative branch, as it does in a parliamentary system. The cabinet is separate. They're usually independent advisors to the president. What's similar, though, between a presidential and a parliamentary system, both a parliament and a legislature in a presidential system make laws. It's where debate happens. It's where political reputations are made. Politicians use each other for support in making policy, etc. I don't think that you could see the concept of a backbencher. All backbenchers are literally, so if this is the front, okay, this is where the prime minister sits with the cabinet, and here you have the opposition leader with his shadow cabinet. Backbenchers literally sit in the back of where the rest of the party sits. They're called backbenchers because here you can see the back benches. They're called backbenchers because they don't have as much seniority as everybody else. They're not as powerful as the ministers. Again, what's important about Parliament, the role of Parliament in the UK, publicizing issues, debating legislation, going over scrutinizing public policy, hearing from interest groups, government departments, making decisions, passing laws. Okay. You don't need to stress about this, but this is, when I have time in class, I usually run through all the particulars of where everything is in Parliament. Again, this is, you might notice I'm saying Parliament when I'm having us look at the House of Commons. Again, that's the asymmetrical part of it. Usually people in the UK are going to say Parliament. They're really talking about the House of Commons, not the House of Lords. Here's the House of Lords. Okay. Ooh, House of Commons, not as schwanky benches as the House of Lords. Okay. House of Lords, notice 822 members in the House of Lords. They're the world's largest legislative assembly. They can start bills, they can amend bills or acts of parliament. They can delay bills, but they really don't have any power other than that. They used to be the highest court in Britain, but Britain does have a Supreme Court now. Remember that Britain doesn't have a constitution though, so we're talking about constitution. The British Supreme Court doesn't actually decide the constitutionality of an action. They examine the action of a government when it comes to precedent and common law. I don't think you're going to need to see the House of Lords Act. The bottom line is that House of Lords, people are not elected, they are selected. There are very few hereditary peers. There are religious leaders in the House of Lords. And once you're in for life, unless you get booted. And there's a vote to remove you by the House of Lords, but I don't think that's ever happened, not recently. So you're a life peer, and you get your permission, or you get your lordship, usually by selection from within the House of Commons or by the House of Commons, and approval by the Queen. Okay, here's the tradition, super important in Parliament. This is the opening of Parliament. Don't need to know all the details other than the fact that when Parliament is open, the opening of Parliament is when we get a new government after an election. The Queen opens Parliament, but in talk about a gradualism or an evolutionary democracy, the Queen has so little power and so little say over Parliament. The concept is parliamentary supremacy, that the speech that she reads, the Queen's speech at the opening of Parliament, is actually written by the government. So she's sitting on the throne in the House of Lords. She's symbolically the leader, the head of state for all of the United Kingdom, but she's reading a speech that was written for her by the government leading the House of Commons. So she's kind of like a figurehead. Don't worry about that. That's the same thing. Here is an example of kind of a review question, something that would come up on a concept based question that would be comparative in nature. So process used in the parliamentary system for the selection of the chief executive. The process used is we have an election when a party gains a majority of the seats in the election to the parliament, whereas they might only receive a plurality of the vote. They have to gain a majority of the seats in parliament. Then they select the chief executive, who's the leader of the party through the election, and that person then becomes the prime minister. Okay, versus a presidential system where direct voters directly select through an election the executive by voting. And the legislative branch is not involved at all because of separation of powers. Removing the chief executive, Lynn, you mentioned vote of no confidence. There you go, vote of no confidence. That's how you remove the chief executive in a parliamentary system. Contrast that with the impeachment process. The impeachment process is longer. It's a political and a legal process, which means it can also be very divisive. and lead to lots of delays in making government decisions. And it doesn't always work. You can have an impeachment and it doesn't go through, like we saw in President Trump's administration. Other than removal process, a check on executive power within a parliamentary system. Well, one, like probably the most obvious check in a parliamentary system on the prime minister is his own party or her own party. That ministers within the cabinet and the prime minister's party as a whole can block policies. Good example of that is Theresa May's approach to Brexit. Her own party did not support the way that she was approaching it, thought that her power is being used in a way that did not support the best interests of the British people. As a result, she had to survive those 2 votes of no confidence and eventually stepped down. Okay, another check on executive power within a parliamentary system would be the power of public opinion, as seen through the opposition party consistently challenging the leadership and the effectiveness of the dominant party in parliament. Again, right now the opposition party in the UK is Labour, although it's Labour really working with the Scottish National Party. Another review, okay, so bicameral legislation, stronger lower house, it's asymmetric and a unique relationship to the executive. It's what's called, again, the fused executive. 2 functions exercised by the House of Commons in Britain. They pass laws, they have public debate, discussion. They are places where tradition is upheld. Lords are chosen and approved of by the House of Commons. Why is the House of Commons effective in limiting the power of the executive? Well, because a simple vote of no confidence can immediately result in a prime minister leaving office. Executive does consist of a head of government and head of state. Important. In the UK, the head of government is the prime minister, the head of state is the queen. Similarity, comparatively, head of government in Iran is the president, head of state in Iran is the Ayatollah, okay? Head of government leads the bureaucracy, leads the creation of policy, works with his or her political party to advance an agenda that supports the policy needs of the people of a country, versus a head of state who may be symbolic, but who represents the state when it comes to diplomacy, foreign policy, and decisions and connections that the country has outside of its borders. Head of government, Great Britain, prime minister. Head of state in Great Britain, queen. Okay. Probably the only kind of fine little point of this, and I don't think it'll come up on the exam, folks, but even though parliaments, the concept again here is called parliamentary supremacy, even though parliament is supreme, even over the queen, when an act of parliament is passed that is going to become a law, the queen signs it. Okay. And the law actually is not officially legal until the queen signs it. The queen does have what's called the right of refusal, which means she could say, I'm not signing this law, but that hasn't happened since Queen Victoria. So again, I don't think that'll come up. It might in a real picky sense, but I've not ever seen it come up on the exam. That would be like bonus unicorn rainbow points if it would show up as a soft power of the head of state in the UK, but it's in the UK only. In Iran, the Ayatollah has a great deal more power than the Queen in the UK as a head of state, because he leads the military and has direct appointment powers to key political and religious organizations that are involved in the government of Iran, and can even prevent presidential candidates from appearing on the ballot. doesn't sign laws, but is the ultimate interpreter of all Sharia law. So I don't know if you would have a comparative question that would be about head of state versus head of government, but both the UK and Iran would be good examples of how a head of state and head of government would function differently than a president would, where the head of state and head of government are the same person. And I think that is it for that little additional slide deck. How we doing, folks? Benicio, would Putin? No, no. Important distinction. Okay. Russia has a prime minister. Remember, constitutionally, whenever you're looking at things and examining things for the exam, we want to talk about what the Russian constitution says. All right. Versus, and that's when we're talking about the constitution, we're talking the Russian political system versus Russian political culture, which is the practices, the tradition, the precedents set that are outside of the constitution. So in Russia, constitutionally, the president is the head of state. The prime minister is the head of government. It is in the slide deck under the concepts of the executive and legislative branch. I think it was like F4. The concept that Russia has, better term for it is that it is a semi-presidential system. Okay. Semi-presidential because the prime minister and the president share the powers that a president would have in a federal and other federal systems. Now, you are correct that in practice, the prime minister of Russia has virtually no political capital, has very little influence in political culture, and Vladimir Putin functions both as head of state and head of government, even though structurally he is not. That would be an excellent kind of yes, but a rebuttal to put in when it comes to something like authoritarianism or what it means, how single party control can weaken a federal government. If that addresses your question with that one. Okay, awesome. Got a thumbs up. Carrie, Lynn, any additional questions? Anything that came up with Britain that you have a question on, or anything that you've seen that you've been studying that has come up that you want to ask me? If not, I'm going to pause recording again. So I'm going to pause it.